daughter. I'm Hindutva and Gupta. I'm delighted that Makarand Paranjape has joined me in conversation today. What we're discussing with Makarand Paranjape, among many other things, is his new book, and I want to hold it up: Hindutva and Hind Swaraj, History's Forgotten Doubles. An excellent new book. Makarand is also holding it up. Thanks, Makarand. A brilliant new book. Makarand, congratulations. I see, of course, on the cover of the book, the late S.L. Bhairappa, who we just lost very tragically, his wonderful quote saying, an inviting and compelling exploration of the ideological and political differences between Mahatma Gandhi and Savarkar. I want to discuss with you, Makarand, as we spoke of before this interview, about the ideological contestations that make modern India, today's India, and their ramifications around the world as India rises in the world. And I want to put that question to you to start off with. This is your book. This book is about the definitive ideological contestation: Gandhi versus Savarkar, Hind Swaraj versus Hindutva, which really is the kernel of today's India. Talk to me a little bit about what it is all about, in your opinion, and how it has a ramification on India as a rising power.
Thank you, Hindol. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you again. I think that we have to go back to pre-independent times to understand the full ramifications of your question, because Hindutva and Hind Swaraj represent two ways of combating and overcoming imperialism. We were colonized by the British for close to 200 years. It was a very difficult interregnum for Indian society and civilization. You know how they beggared and paupered us. And I would always say to my students, and I repeat it possibly in my book, that the signature of the British Empire in India was famine. More than 50 million people died in the 150 or 170 years of British rule in India. Now, along with these two ideologies which were contending for the public, space and trust and imagination, there were other ideologies, as we know, like, the separatist Islamist ideology, which I also mentioned briefly. But, that ideology was mostly collaborationist. So when we talk about the international geopolitical order today, we notice how ideologies of that kind, ideologies of extreme violence, like, extreme left and extreme, let's say, Islamism, I call them death cults after Douglas Murray, have a very strange and extremely dangerous collaboration. But this book is not concerned with, as it were, those contending ideologies which were opposing Swaraj. I call that basically a Swaraj versus Jihad fight. And this book is not about that. This book is about two ways of winning Swaraj. And fundamentally, the point of departure is 1909, when Savarkar wrote the first War of Independence, first Indian War of Independence. 1909, published clandestinely, smuggled into India in boxes of Pickwick Papers and other such benign-sounding British classics, and obviously banned both in British India and then outside. I mean, in India itself, banned in Britain where it was not even known. The printer was clandestine again, and it was actually printed in Europe and smuggled into India. And Gandhiji's Hind Swaraj, a sort of gospel of non-violent revolution. So you have violent revolution and non-violent revolution. So these are the two, as it were, contending ideologies within the larger Hindu umbrella. Now, let me sort of come back to your question into contemporary times. We've seen the Nehruvian era and then Indira Gandhi and so on. I think we've had a very unrealistic foreign policy, if I may say so, pious and sentimental. And I think we've shifted to realism only recently with the Modi doctrine. But even today, I believe that we are still trying to balance, these two perceptions of who or what we are. The moral upholder of dharma, call it ahimsa, call it peaceful coexistence, call it vasudhaiva kutumbakam, and on the other hand, a regional player with boots on the ground and, developing our own arsenal, homemade armaments, exporting arms. So it's a complex, I would say, legacy as well as the way forward. But I think, as my book argues, we need both. We need that Vishwaguru kind of higher moral ground because both Sanatan Dharma and India have always stood for peaceful coexistence and have always stood for the welfare of all beings. You know, it's not just, it's not a selfish ethnic or even religious approach, but really a collaborative, cooperative approach since times immemorial. So we have to retain that moral compass which distinguishes us from many other warlike, imperialistic, and conquering civilizations. And at the same time, be more realistic because unless you have weaponry or unless you're a very large economy or a combination of both, you're not respected in the community, the Committee of Nations worldwide. So I feel that, as I suggest in my book, we need, in some sense, we need both Gandhi and Savarkar because Savarkar had a wonderful, and he was very prescient. So he had a wonderfully prescient understanding of global affairs and knew that, and in fact, at one point, he called Gandhi a madcap for being so unrealistic, idealistic, romantic, foolish, whatever. And yet, the Gandhian emphasis on self purification, the highest moral standards, truth, nonviolence, ahimsa, are still very important as beacons to the world because Homo sapiens cannot live the way it is. So we have to, you know, gesture and beckon towards a different world order based not only on might is right, but on higher moral values, a higher consciousness, if you will.
I also want to talk to you, Makaranda. And for those, I mean, most people watching this would know who you are, but for the few people who may not know, Makarand Paranjape spent a lifetime in the Jawaharlal Nehru University as professor, where at last count, he was probably one of the most prolific, publisher of all kinds of things, monographs and books and, articles and edited volumes and everything that was possible to publish, Makarand Paranjape published. Uh, I want to also therefore ask you,
Except an autobiography, which I hope
except an
I'll write
autobiography,
someday.
but perhaps that will also come soon, Makaranda. But let me ask you, and I think this is a question many people don't ask, and I think you've hit a very important point. There is an aesthetic to the act of rising. The act of rising is not merely about power alone. It is, of course, fundamentally about power. We must have the guns and we must have the currency and we must have the economic strength and we must have the manufacturing. All of that is true. But I think your book, this book, also hints at this aesthetic quality to the act of rising, which is why you're saying, in some senses, we need both Savarkar and Gandhi. And I wonder if you could talk a little about that.
Oh, absolutely. I would only add that aesthetics and ethics, because I think that Hindu civilization, India, has always placed a huge premium, a huge value on both, because the ethical foundation, of society, of polity, is what, in my view, distinguishes us because we are a dharmic civilization. Some people have called us a dharmocracy. I think that's a good phrase, a dharmocracy. Uh, so the ethical foundations not only of wealth and power, but also of governance and mutuality, relations between people, communities, and nations in the world. That's what India stands for. So dharma, ethics, righteous conduct, virtue on the one hand, and then you rightly brought in aesthetics because that nobody talks about really. And I think it's really the rasa. Hindus, whenever they did well, they wanted to enjoy life to the fullest. The rich diversity of experience, even sensual experience, lived experience the vital world of sounds and lights and colors and tastes and everything, music, art, beauty, poetry, Soundarya. this is India. And I think that you're absolutely right. The way India rises should also be attractive to the rest of the world. And people call that soft power or smart power. And we know how, widespread and pervasive American pop culture has been. I think India has so much to offer in that respect. Not only yoga and cuisine, but really the aesthetics of power, which is what Swaraj means. Basically, that is, if you're more powerful, you show restraint and gentleness. And if you're powerless, you must have the courage to resist authority and power, which Gandhi showed us how to. And in a way, again, a very interesting convergence between Gandhi and Savarkar. Both were fearless. So it's an inner to outer transformation. You start with soul power. You start with the, Atma Shakti, if you want to. And then you operationalize it, and then you externalize it so that, your enemy sort of doesn't trample over you thinking you're weak and defenseless, but learns to respect you. And I think that both ethics and aesthetics have a huge role to play in this kind of rising.
I also want to talk to you about why this sense that we need both um, wasn't really understood in the polarizing ethical environment of the 1947 moment, so to speak, Makaran. What I'm fundamentally asking is, this is, in a sense, what you're saying sounds almost obvious today. We obviously need, as it were, the four purushats, right, to, have a complete sense of life. We do need a sense of material power. We do need a sense of protecting the civilization from invaders, but we also need a sense of higher purpose, of truth telling, of a ethical duty, so to speak, and moral virtue. But in that 1947 moment, Makran, this was obviously not very understood. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had so many decades of this polarization. Uh, could you, in your opinion, give us some sense of why you think this was not understood in that critical moment?
Yes, actually, the real polarization, in my view, happens much later. See, the way the history of the freedom struggle has been constructed by those who were in power for almost 65 years, we don't have to name them, uh, has always been in terms of communalism, versus nationalism. But what I try to show in my book is that even in the nationalist big tent, there were so many different views and opinions. Now, after independence, I would say that, Nehruvian secularism was a kind of hothouse plant. It didn't take root in native Indian soil. In fact, we don't have good words for either secularism or socialism in Indian languages. Whereas Swaraj or even Azadi, which is a Persian word, has much greater resonance. So the enemy, for that ideological, should I say, plank, which is what Congress devolved into later, was Hindu communism, because they did not want the Hindu genie to be unbottled, to get out of the bottle, because they knew that it would threaten the foundations of their minoritarian coalition. So they created this false, in my opinion, opposition, antinomy between Gandhi and Savarkar, so that Hindutva became a bad word. In fact, this book, you'll be surprised, Hindol, has had such visceral reactions from people for whom even Hindutva, which is now a well accepted phrase in politics, in history, it has a provenance of about more than 100 years going back to Chandranath Basu, made much more popular, famous by Savarkar and so forth. And really, the ruling party talks about this, and yet a whole sort of chunk of the commentariat is reacting just to this phrase in the cover of my book and wants to cancel it, saying, "Oh, you can't be talking about that word." Earlier, they would have said that about Hindu, but as you know, you've written books in which Hindu is the title of the book. Being Hindu, a lovely book, by the way, which really opened up things to a younger generation, Gen Z or Gen X or whatever. So, both, the terminology and the ideological moorings of these phrases, I would think cannot be cancelled anymore. Now, during the independence struggle, in fact, people like Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, who were the founders of the Hindu Mahasabha, were even members of, you know, uh, and were founders of what we may call a broader Hindutva, were very much members of the Congress, as you know. Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, the founder of the RSS, whose 100th anniversary we are celebrating, was very much a member of the Congress, went to jail more than once, in fact, twice. He participated in the civil disobedience movement. So all of these were a part of, as I said, the broader Swaraj struggle, that broader tent of a coalition against imperialism. But after independence, they banned the RSS, and of course, Mahatma Gandhi's murder was a very unfortunate thing. Godse and the conspirators, Narayan Apte, Badge, and the others, killed, in my view, a defenseless old man, whereas they were boasting about throwing bombs in the Pakistan parliament and so forth. It was not that difficult, frankly, to kill Gandhi. He was not well guarded. Savarkar's own linkage with that, is still up in the air. But to me, that's not very important, because the fact is that, as I argue in my book, that both Hinduism as well as, India as a state, as a civilization, have room for both. Forget about their individual differences of opinion. And in fact, Gandhi was very much more open and forgiving if you look at it historically. He even wrote to the viceroy after Savarkar's mercy petitions that both the brothers, the elder brother, whom we call Baba Rao Savarkar, and Veer Savarkar, had both suffered enough and served, long sentences in prison, and they should be released. Whereas, in some sense, the other side, for whatever reason, and there were historic reasons for it, considered Gandhi to be really a crackpot. And it's interesting how a lot of people, even Dr. Ambedkar, thought Gandhi's views were very rational, etc., etc. So, what I'm trying to say is that, at least from Gandhi's side, if you look at the historical record, he had only nice things to say about, though he disagreed with Savarkar's method, he had nice things to say about Savarkar and what he did for India's freedom. Uh, now, the point I'm making is that Savarkar, why do we need Savarkar? We need Savarkar as a way to ideologically align Hindus, because otherwise Hindus are not ideologically aligned or politically mobilized. So Savarkar, Hindutva, these have been instruments for that mobilization, and it's been quite successful, as we know. But we also need Savarkar for a strategic vision. And Uday Mahurkar has made that point earlier, that he saw the real threat to India, uh, you know, of Muslim separatism, and was one of the first ones to identify that threat. And I mean, some people go to the extent of arguing that the partition of India could have been prevented if the Congress had listened to Savarkar's warnings after the Khilafat agitation and the Mopla massacre and so forth. Now, the verdict is out on that. We don't know, we don't know what history might have been, because, frankly, Muslim separatism could not, I would say, could not have been defeated without a violent conflict, frankly, a civil war even. And the British wouldn't have allowed it. Instead, they allowed these riots in which millions died, as we know. So that portion of our history is very unfortunate. But, look at Pahalgam. We know that we're still in this kind of fight. And from Bangladesh as well, the elements of whatever Jamaat and others are, again, very powerful. So, to answer your question, uh, the obvious, what you call the obvious imperative to combine these approaches hasn't even today been given a serious try. And that's because the Congress continues to, as it were, abuse the RSS. The Congress leadership continues to try to cancel people like Savarkar, the object to his portrait or his bust or the airports being named after him. So it's their ideological compulsion to keep flogging a dead horse. You might call it pseudo secularism, if you like. It doesn't work at the hustings. It doesn't work ideologically. And therefore, I think that the broader, so to speak, Hindu society and polity needs to find a way to reconcile these two figures, even if not at the simple level, at the personal or historic level. Just as, you know, the Gita, frankly, allows for violence, righteous violence in extreme situations. It's only Gandhiji who fetishized non-violence almost on an impractical level. And we've dialed back from it. Even Nehru did after the Chinese debacle. So therefore, I think this urgent need to to incorporate both of these in a broader Hindu and Indian civilizational framework, I think the time has come. That urgent need needs to be addressed now, and I don't think it is all that difficult. And I suppose politically, the polarization, as you said, the political polarization will continue whenever there are elections. But as a society, as a country, as a community, we need both.
I also want to ask you, sir, and at the moment, most of your comments in this answer has been confined to the domestic, and I want to move you to the international. I want to ask you, in this moment where you're seeing some sort of reconciliation between these two ideological frameworks, so to speak, talk to me a little bit about how or what this means as India rises in a fractured world, because there is an ideological fracture, Makarand, not only in India, but perhaps far more vigorously today in America, in the United Kingdom, in Europe. There are many parts, and certainly in the Middle East. So there is a far deeper, far more vicious fracture today, ideological fracture happening in other parts of the world outside India. Can an Indian reconciliation, ideological reconciliation of sorts, have something to offer to that dialogue, or in that dialogue of fracture that's going on in the Western world, in the Middle East?
Oh, definitely, definitely. In fact, I've hinted as much in the book because you see, you've raised some very, very important questions. Let me break it down to at least 2 or 3 points. The first point is in recent decades, we have at last started mining, and you might even say deploying the vast strategic and diplomatic resources of Hindu texts. Not just Chanakya, which has been, as it were, almost like a cliche. Whenever we talk about Indian diplomacy, instead of the prince, we have Kautilya or Chanakya, and of course Kautilya predates Machiavelli by centuries, right? And for all you know, it's Kautilyan ideas that went to Europe, were circulated the world over. And Kautilya is also about dharma, about a good king, but who's also very practical when it comes to finding, ways to defeat his enemies, also very practical and fair and just when it comes to internal governance, collecting taxes, also using spies, all of that. So it's a very good handbook, I would say, for diplomacy. But more recently, as you know, our own External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has been using the Ramayana and Mahabharata as sources of diplomatic thinking, of strategic thinking. And I think these are welcome moves. I think India has so much to offer to the world when it comes to, finding ways of reconciliation and yet being pragmatic. Even, all our Niti Shastras, they show you how to have the highest, the loftiest ideals at the spiritual level, at the ethical level. And yet, as the Panchatantra will tell you, be very practical. Even Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, in its actual context, there are two places where this is used. One is in the Maha Upanishad. It's a very minor Vaishnavite Upanishad, which is very much more later than the ancient Upanishads like the Kathopanishad or the Ishavasya Upanishad or, Brihadaranyaka, Mandukya. All are great Upanishads. These belong to a much older period. The Maha-Upanishad comes much later and has this, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam idea as a way of peaceful coexistence. But if you go back to Niti Shastra, Panchatantra and the Hitopadesha and these texts, actually, you see the wicked and wily fox using this as a way to trap the bull by saying, look, why should we fight? The world belongs to all of us. And he wants to actually eat the bull. And it's the crow, the wise crow, who warns the bull, hey, don't go by this lofty statement of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. This man or this wily fox or wolf wants to actually kill you and eat you up. So what I'm trying to say is India has a way always to reconcile very lofty principles with very practical ideas. And Gandhi and Savarkar represent that. Savarkar, as we know, was a very practical person, even when it came to, you know, animal husbandry. I'm using a polite word because Gandhi was horrified when they met in 1909 in the India House, which was a den of revolutionaries run by Shamji Krishna Varma. He found Savarkar eating meat, possibly even eating beef. Certainly, he was eating sausages. So Gandhi was horrified. And Savarkar said, I don't care. I mean, because you have to be practical, right? So the holy cow was not so holy to Savarkar, something that many people who are his votaries today don't want to talk about. Similarly, Savarkar had many radical views, not just about caste, but about a number of other, things which traditional Hindus would balk at. But so what I'm trying to say is supremely practical, pragmatic approach, and yet lofty and idealistic. Both of these are spectrums of Hindu thought, and India has a lot to offer. Now, more practically, apply this to the world. Apply this whether it is to Europe or United States. And as I said earlier, I hinted at this in my earlier answer. There are death cults. Freud famously talked about Eros versus Thanatos. Earlier this year, I was in Israel. Again, I don't want to talk too much about it because a lot of people, for them, what's happening in Gaza is very unfortunate. But more than that, if you say that you support Israel, at least up to a certain extent, you support the existence of the Jewish state and so forth. Again, they want to cancel you. Be that as it may. What I want to say is after going to Israel, I realized how much the Jews, in a way, love life. I happened to be in a very nice hotel, and when Sabbath opened, I saw, children running around, eating, laughing. And I realized Hindus also love life. We enjoy, I said earlier, rasa. You go to Banaras, the heart of Indian culture, as it were. From wrestling, to concubines, cuisine, everything is celebrated, and the ghats are burning day and night. So it's, in the face of death and transience, which we accept philosophically, as you know, you've written a beautiful book on that. We still celebrate life. We are a joyous civilization. And to some extent, let me put it this way, liberal democracies the world over, they also celebrate life. They're open and they want to improve the living conditions of, even capitalism, I don't think is a death cult, if you ask me. So it has certain problems, as Gandhiji said in Hind Swaraj, through overconsumption, through immorality. You might, through excess, actually turn into a suicidal culture or civilization. I call them sometimes zombies or vampires, If you go towards extreme consumption, you can get medicalized and turn into actually a zombie, as is happening in the West. The fentanyl zombies and so forth. So sad. Or you can turn into this, you know, vampire on steroids, up all night, trying to juice life, preying on other lives. The Epstein scandal is an example of that. How unethical, how immoral when you're preying on little children. And in India too, by the way, you live in Delhi. Every day, little children, little girls are being abducted. Every day. And we've not done much, despite being Beti Bachao and all that. I've written articles, I've written open letters, and now we have a lady CM. We should break the back of this child trafficking horrible thing. They go to busties. So anyhow, so my point is the modern West as well is not a death cult. I don't believe it is. So I think democratic countries the world over need to align, and you know who the other side is. And I'm happy to say that in the heart of desert religions, there is a new move, a breath of fresh air, where, even, you know, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, has asked, for a new way to interpret not only the Quran, but even the Hadith, and, you know, downplaying the violent and the anti, so to speak, unbelievers, non-believers type of rhetoric and ideology. UAE is now very open, very friendly. Even in Iran, there is a groundswell of resistance to the, ayatollahs and the mullahs and the moral police. So I think in the world today, we have these alignments. And I have said that there is an arc of democracy, and India is the linchpin as the world's largest democracy. India is the fulcrum of this, this rainbow of democracy, or this arc of democracy, Noah's Ark, biblical metaphor. If you have to save democracy, and so I'm very saddened, at the current. I think again, it's not going to last, but this kind of one-upmanship and rhetoric, Donald Trumpism, you may call it. I think America and India need to have better ties as two democracies than like Israel, which has as many Jews in US as in Israel. Our diaspora in the US has reached a critical mass. We have vice presidential candidates, we have presidential candidates of Indian origin, we have, second ladies, we have people, FBI directors. We have broken the glass ceiling. The top tech companies, as you know, have have Indian CEOs. So we need a much better alignment, if not really an alliance. So going back to geopolitics, we know that non-alignment didn't work. And I believe, strategic autonomy is only a new word, a new phrase for non-alignment. It doesn't work when push comes to shove. I think that multilateralism is wonderful, but we still need to have a much clearer alignment, with democratic forces all over the world. And yet, of course, we want peaceful coexistence with China, but we know, just look at the size of China when the Communist Revolution took place. They increased about 50%. Tibet is almost two-thirds the size, 75%, three-fourths the size of India is just Tibet. Taking over Tibet, India and China now are eyeball to eyeball, which was never the case in history. We always had a buffer. So the world is very complex, as you rightly said. It's very unpredictable. But I think our imperatives should be clear. And I think our leadership also understands that despite the rhetoric, the noise, I think that geopolitical alignments are going to clarify in the next, I would say, few years, even if not in the few months. And I think we're going to see a repositioning of not just democratic forces on one side, but also those who love life. Let's not forget that in Maoist China, 40, 50 million people died. If you look at Frank Dicotta's China tetralogy, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, these were death camps. The great Solzhenitsyn, I mean, how he told us what he blew the lid off, though, of course, again, and, after Stalin, everybody was talking about it already. We know what had happened in these sort of communist regimes. It's not just about not having freedoms as we understand them, but, there's no compassion. Humanity is only a statistic in this bigger ideological, pseudo-scientific, whatever you want to call it, dialectical materialism. The Moulin Rouge, not Moulin Rouge, the Khmer Rouge, sorry, pardon me, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia was a death dance, to use the Moulin Rouge
Yes.
metaphor. It was a dance of death. So what I'm trying to say is democratic polities and life affirming ideologies, it seems to me, fall on one side, and death comes. And those who don't want freedom for human beings and just want to control everything, totalitarian, authoritarian systems on the other side. I think this is the broader opposition
Mm.
moving forward geopolitically and with variation, with multipolarity, heteropolarity. All these things are also a part of the game. And the last thing I wanted to say really is China has been, with due respect, it's a great civilization. I've been to China 10 times. Great people, highly resilient. And the Chinese state, the communist state, has achieved amazing things, frankly. I have the highest respect for what they have accomplished, how many millions they've lifted from poverty, their efficiency, their hard work, their ethic, their creativity, everything. It's a meritocracy, Hindus, frankly. Anyhow, so kudos to them. But yet, please tell me, can China, the Chinese model, really serve the world? Mild, this whole authoritarian. In fact, I want to end this segment by telling you, I'm also alarmed at how mildly and actually dangerously authoritarian Hindus are becoming. We want benign dictators now because things are so chaotic. They just said, give us a strong man, fix everything. But no, that's not our way. Our way is debate, dissent, and tremendous, should I say, argumentation. We are argumentative Indians, even if not in the Amort percent sense of the word.
Excellent. We only have a minute or so left, Makarand, on this conversation. And therefore, everything that you have said, in conclusion, I noticed in your book that you quote Dharampal, the great Dharampal, who wrote so lucidly and so beautifully about India's contribution to the world. Let's end with that, on that note, because the world also needs education, among other things. Perhaps, in a minute, you could encapsulate, this wonderful book that you've written. um, what is India's final, or what ought to be India's final lesson, as it were, as it evolves to take its place among the biggest powers in the world? What lesson would India hold up to the world, drawing from, of course, Hind Swaraj and Hindutva, the ideological contestation that made modern India?
So Hindol, education is the most important frontier now. What with AI and this digital information overload. And I've called, in this book, I've called it the global gurukul, to which I invite, as a student teacher, everybody to join. And you and I, your podcast is a part of this global gurukul. So we want to open up the doors, for a Swarajist approach to thinking. This book is as much about how to think, as you know, Hindol. It has this whole section on itihas mimamsa. Now, mimamsa means a very deep reflection. Today, everybody in India is talking about IKS, Indian Knowledge System. So we have a lot to offer the world. And I think the Western dominance in both the production as well as the dissemination of knowledge is being challenged everywhere. And I think this book is also adding to that conversation, and podcasts such as yourself. See, we are all university people. I've served in universities all my life. And now I understand very much after COVID, as the book starts over there, that brick and mortar universities are not going to do it anymore. So we have to create these global gurukuls for a new consciousness. And I think that would be my one word summary of what this book is. It's an invitation to a global gurukul so that we all work together for a transformation of our consciousness.
Amazing. Wonderful. That's a lovely sum up, Makarand. Brilliant book, Hindutva and Hind Swaraj, History's Forgotten Doubles. Makarand Paranjape, congratulations on the new book. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Hindul. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.